For this video, we are going to start looking at the skull. Prior videos that I have done here on YouTube talk about how bone gets formed and how we take bones and divide them into different groups or different processes and depressions that are on bones. And what we're going to focus on in this video is looking at what are called some of the cranial bones. Now, in the case of your skeletal system, you do have 206 bones in your body. And we take those 206 bones and we divide them into two groups. We have what we call the axial skeleton, and we have what we call the appendicular skeleton. Now, the axial skeleton is what you see here in green. It is basically what you would call the bones of the body. So the cranium, which is your skull, your costa, which are your ribs, your sternum, which is your breastbone, and then your vertebra, all make up what we call the axial skeleton. In another video, I'll be talking about the bones of the appendicular skeleton. Your appendicular skeleton is referring to the bones of your appendages. So we have what we call the pectoral girdle, which would be like your shoulders, your arms, your wrists, your hands, and your fingers. And we have the pelvic girdle, which are your hips, your legs, your ankles, your feet, and your toes. But in the case of the cranium, your cranium is divided up into two different sections. And we have what we call your cranial bones and what we call your facial bones. And the cranial bones are the ones that form what we call the brain cavity, or the I lost the train of thought, but that's okay. But these are like your frontal bones, which you have two parietal bones, two temporal bones, a sphenoid bone, an ethmoid bone, and an occipital bone. But when I talk about the cranial bones, I do the external bones, and then I'll talk about the internal bones, and then we'll do the face. Now on here, you'll see the term sutured. When we have joints, most of the joints you think of are what we call movable joints or diarthrosis joints. Well, in your skull, you have non-movable joints, or what are called synarthrosis joints. And these are bones. A joint is anywhere two bones come together, but in your skull, most of the bones are literally fused together. And so we're going to be talking about things called sutures. The only movable bone you have in your skull is your mandible, so that's you can chew. You don't want a lot of bones moving around in your skull because you don't want to accidentally pinch your brain and damage your brain in any way. So we're going to focus on, like I said, what I call the four sets of external cranial bones. You have the frontal bone, which is what you think of as your forehead, which is what you see here in yellow. You also have the parietal bone, which are the two bones on the side. So like if you take your fingers and lace them together and sit them on top of your head, I always tell my class, like somebody who's been arrested, what you're touching there are your parietal bones. If you then take your hands and cover your ears, what you're touching there are your temporal bones. And if you put your hand on the back of your head, what you're touching there is your one occipital bone. Now, the purpose of your brain case is to protect your brain. And so there's different sutures that come together. Now, your parietal bone is often called the keystone bone because pretty much every bone in your skull attaches to the parietal bones in some way. And as we talk about the different bones, we're going to talk about special features that these bones have. Okay? But what we're going to start with here is this thing called the frontal bone. So the frontal bone is what most people think of as your forehead. But as you can see here, it is an example of a flat bone, and it does curve backwards. If you take your hand and do a high five and put it on your nose and just kind of touch your forehead, you know it curves. Everything your hand is touching is frontal bone. It's not just your forehead. Now, your forehead does have a name. It would be found about right here. This part is flat. And so for those people who've watched my other videos or you've been in my class, you know that the anatomical term for something that's flat is squamous. So what you call your forehead is commonly called your frontal squamous. Now, we are bilateral animals, so most bones in our body have a partner. You have two nasal bones, you have two lacrimal bones, you have two zygomatic bones. You have one mandible, but we actually have proof right here that it used to be two bones. Well, the same thing is true with your frontal bone. We have one frontal bone, but as you can see in this picture, there's this thing right here, this little ancient suture. Okay? And a suture is where bones have fused together. It's a non-movable joint. And this area is called the glabella, Glabella. And before I forget, again, if a lot of times in my videos, I talk about the anatomy coloring book. The anatomy coloring book that I use is by Wynn Capit, K-A-P-I-T. And the one that I have with me is the 4th edition. It actually has skulls on the front of it. But if you have an anatomy coloring book, any version that you have, you can kind of follow along with me. In my coloring book, I'm on page 22. It says bones of the skull, and you'll see this picture on that page. But in the case of a suture, like I mentioned, a suture is where two bones literally fuse together. And remember, muscles cover bones. So wherever there's a suture, there's an indentation. And wherever there's an indentation, the muscle will indent, which means the skin is going to indent. This is why you have your hair parts, as you're going to see in a second. But you guys all know that we have this little indentation right between our eyes. And that indentation is an ancient suture. It's called the glabella, which leads a lot of scientists to think that at one point in time, we had two frontal bones. But with the way that our brain developed, it fused together to one nice smooth bone. Now we are going to look at different features that we have on the frontal bone, because the frontal bone is, part of your face. It is part of what you see. But in the case of your frontal bone, like I mentioned, what you call your forehead is the frontal squamous. Well, if you'll notice, you have eyebrows, and your skull has eyebrows. And if you have the anatomy coloring book, it's really hard to draw a bump. Your eyebrows are actually bumps. They're what are called protuberances. And if you watch another video I have that talks about prostheses and depressions, we'll talk about tuberosities and tubercles. These are things that have B's in them because they're bumps. Well, you have an elongated bump over each eye. And that's what we call your supraciliary arch. Okay? Supraciliary arch. In anatomy, anytime you see ciliary, it has something to do with your eyelashes or your tears. And so like your ciliary gland is oftentimes what we call your tear gland. But we have these supraciliary arches. These are bumps that we have on our skull. Well, because they are a bump, muscle lays across that bump differently, which means the skin's going to lay across that differently. And we have hair, and that's what gives us our eyebrows. Now, remember, our ancient ancestors were covered with hair, and for the most case, hair is vestigial in us. A vestigial structure is something that we don't need anymore. Hair is used by our ancestors for warmth and for camouflage. That's not what we need to do anymore. We don't have to camouflage. We don't need hair anymore. We don't need hair to keep us warm anymore. So for the most part, the hair that we do have on our body filters. That's why you wash your hair. Well, your eyebrows are there to trap trash. Because if you think about it, when things, gravity is going to pull trash downward. And so your eyebrows are going to catch that trash before it falls into your eyes. And so the reason we have the curved eyebrows that we have is because the bump underneath them, which is called the supraciliary arch, is what forms our eyebrows. Now, if you'll notice, we also have these holes in the corners of our eyes. And again, if you watch my other YouTube video, we talked about these things called foramens. Anytime you have a foramen is a hole through a bone, and that is there to cause that to allow for passageway of nerves and blood vessels. Well, the reason you have your upper eyelids, when you look at yourself, everything that you look at is dead, other than your eyeballs. Your eyeballs are living. And we have our upper eyelids to help protect our eyes. And the reason we blink is to basically, your eyeball has no feeling nerves. Every time you blink, your upper eyelid basically scrapes your eyeball, and it pushes all this dirty mucus down into your lower eyelid, which is why your eyelids tilt inward, because you have another little bone here. It's in green. It's called the lacrimal bone, and it's got a little opening in it. A lot of people call that your tear duct, and that's not what that is. It's a drainage tube. But your tear gland is actually in your upper eyelid. So when you blink, you squeeze that tear gland and water comes out. And that water washes over your eye. And since your eye is living, it keeps your eye moist. It also helps push dirt down into your lower eyelid. Well, we have nerves that have to tell our eyelids to open and close. So we have these two openings here, and those are what we call your supraorbital foramens. Supra meaning above, and orbital referring to your eyes. So we have the supraciliary arch. Well, again, a lot of times in anatomy, ciliary is referring to tear glands. And so that means above your tear gland. Your supraorbital foramens are above your eyes, and that's where the nerves pass through that basically tell you to blink. And by blinking, that's going to help clean your eye out. So with the frontal bone, we talked about the frontal squamous. We have our eyebrows, which are the supraciliary arches. We have this ancient suture that's commonly called the glabella. And we have our supraorbital foramens. Now, as you can see with your eye socket here, your eye socket has lots of different colors, but you can't see the top of your eye socket. The top of your eye socket is actually made from frontal bone. So if you were to close your eyes and very gently press, you'll feel where the bone curves under. Let me erase these red lines so you can see what it is I'm talking about. And I'm going to use green here. But this region right here, oops, not doing very good. That region right there, where the frontal bone curves under, that's what's called the supraorbital margin. The supraorbital margin. That's where it curves under in order to form the top of your eye socket. And remember, your eye socket is an example of what's called a fossa. Now, also with your frontal bone, again, your frontal bone articulates with what's called your parietal bones. And the term articulate means to form a joint. So we have a parietal bone on this side, it's in green, and we have a parietal bone on the other side that's also in green. So we actually have a suture, as you can see here, called the coronal suture. And it goes from here all the way around to the other side. It's your coronal suture, and that's where the frontal bone attaches to both parietal bones. And for those of you who have longer hair, when you go to get your hair cut, they brush your bangs forward and you have this bang part that goes from one ear to the next. Well, that's where your coronal suture is found. It's the crown of your head. That's why crowns are called crowns. And so the frontal suture is what articulates, the coronal suture is what articulates your frontal bone to your parietal bones. And if you have the coloring book on page 22, it does show you a side view, which I'll show you again which I'll show you in a moment, and it shows you the coronal suture. So just some features again with the frontal bone. We have the glabella, we have the frontal squamous, we have the supraciliary arch, we have the supraorbital margin, and we have the supraorbital foramens. Now moving on. Oh, here's just another picture. So all this in here, you can kind of see right here, going all the way around, would be your frontal squamous. This right here would be your glabella. You can kind of see the curvature here that makes up your supraciliary arches. Those are where your eyebrows are. And you can see these openings. Those are your you see this opening right here. That's your supraorbital margin. Now you can see that also your frontal bone articulates right here. This is your nasal bone, and your nasal bone is actually fairly small. It's right here, and your nasal bone is part of your face. And you actually have two nasal bones, because going right down the middle is another suture. But I'm getting ahead of myself because those are facial bones. Now, talking about your sutures. Again, this is looking from the top. And so right here, all of this here, let me see if I can get it to highlight. All of this is frontal bone. And so you can see this suture, that's the coronal suture, okay, that attaches your frontal bone to your parietal bones. Now your parietal bones are the two bones that make up the side of your head. Like I said, if you interlace your fingers and place them over your head, like you see when people are arrested, what you're touching under each palm is a parietal bone. Now there's no special features about the parietal bones, it's just that almost all the other bones in your skull attach to the parietal bone, and the cranial bones attach to the parietal bone in some way. And you guys know that you have a part that goes right down the middle of your head, that part right there. Well, that's what's called the sagittal suture. Anytime you see sagittal is something that divides our bodies into a left side and a right side. So we have a left parietal bone and we have a right parietal bone. But as far as the parietal bones go, again, there's nothing really special. There's no real special features about these bones so we're just not really, the only thing that you really need to know as far as my class is concerned is this thing called the sagittal suture. Now, This is a lateral view, and you can also see, if you have the anatomy coloring book, the lateral view on page 22. And so here you can see the frontal bone, and here's a good example or a good view of the coronal suture. And so again, you can see how it goes all the way, basically from one ear to the next. Well, your parietal bones are back here, and the sagittal suture would run here, because that's what attaches, like your mid-hair part. That's what attaches the parietal bone, the two parietal bones together. But the parietal bones, like I said, really have no special features to them. So we're going to move ahead to your temporal bone. And the temporal bone is where you would think of as your ear. So if you take your hands and cover your ears with them, everything that you're touching falls into what we call your temporal bone. And with your temporal bone, as you can see here, the temporal bone attaches to the parietal bone. I need to change the color. Your parietal bone attaches to the temporal bone right here, using what's called the squamous suture. Remember, squamous means flat. And as you can see, it talks about squamosal suture here. That is the suture that attaches your temporal bone to your parietal bone. Now you have two temporal bones, one was on each side of your head. So you have two squamosal or squamous sutures. You have a left temporal bone and you have a right temporal bone. Now, your temporal bone also goes inside of your brain case and forms part of your internal brain structures or cranial structures. And so when we look at the internal bones in a different video, we'll talk more about the temporal bone. But here at the temporal bone is where we find your external auditory meatus. Now, if you watch my other video about processes and depressions here on YouTube, you know that a meatus is basically a long canal. And the temporal bone is what you think of, or the external auditory meatus is what you think of as your ear canal. It's a deep hole. It doesn't go all the way through, so it's not a foramen, but it's longer than a socket, so it's not a fossa. But buried inside of your external auditory meatus are what we call your ossicles. Your ossicles are your three ear bones. They're the smallest bones you have in your body, and you have 6 of them. You have 3 on each side. And in elementary school and middle school, you might have learned of them as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Well, for our purposes, they're what's called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Okay. Malleus, some people spell it M-A-L-L-O-U-S. Some people spell it M-A-L-L-E-O-U-S. Okay. Then the incus is I-N-C-U-S, and the stapes is S-T-A-P-E-S. These are your 3 ear bones. So you have 6 ear bones total. So of the 206 bones of your body, 6 of them are your ear bones because you have 3 per ear. And as a group, we call them your ossicles, and those are the smallest bones you have in your body. Now, also with your temporal bone, if you were to flip the skull over, you would see this sharp point, this vampire tooth right here. Now, in this drawing, it's a little over-exaggerated because it's not really that long, but it's drawn longer so that you can see it. And this vampire tooth is what's called the styloid process. This is where some of your jaw muscles attach to help hold your mandible on. Now, if you take your finger and put it behind your ear, you can feel a bump. Okay? If you take your finger and just rub behind your ear, you can feel a bump. Well, that bump you're feeling is what's called the mastoid process. Now, in anatomy, anytime you see the root word mast, like to masticate, that means to chew. And so it gets its name because also some of your jaw muscles attach to that bone. Now, you can't see in this picture, but if you had a skull and you flipped it over, if you put your finger on the mastoid process and then put your finger on the styloid process, if you looked in between them, you'd see a hole. And that's called the stylomastoid foramen. And remember, foramens are holes we have in bones so that nerves and blood vessels can go back and forth. Well, we have a small opening in our skull. It's part of our temporal bone. You can't see it in this picture, but it would be located about right here. And the stylomastoid process is where the nerves come out that basically tell your jaw muscles to let you open and close your mouth. Now, you also have a condyle. Now, what a lot of people call their cheekbones isn't really your cheekbone. If you put your hand on your face and touch what you call your cheek, a lot of you are touching this region right here. Okay? And that is part of your temporal bone. Now, when we look at the face, a process is anywhere bones connect. And so what a lot of people call their cheekbone is actually this bridge. It's called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Your real cheekbone is called your zygomatic bone. It's this one right here. And so this would be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then right here, that would actually be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. When you see the term process in regards to the face, that's going to be a connection point. There's going to be a suture there, and it's going to tell you that two bones have fused together in some way. So a lot of people, when you, like I said, when you touch your, what you call your cheek, you can kind of rock back and forth, and you feel like that narrow bridge. Well, that's actually, again, what's called the zygomatic process of your temporal bone. That lets you know that I'm touching temporal bone, but I'm touching where it attaches to the zygomatic bone. So with the temporal bone, we have your external auditory meatus. That is where your eardrum is found, or excuse me, where your ear canal is found. And the ossicles and your eardrum, which is called your tympanium, are found in that region. You have your mastoid process. You have your styloid process. And then right here, you have what's called your mandibular condyle. Now, a condyle is any area where two bones come together to form a movable joint. So this area is nice and smooth, and it's going to be covered with cartilage. And that type of cartilage is called articular cartilage, and it is made from hyaline cartilage. And on page 22 of the anatomy coloring book, you'll see it. They've labeled it the temporal mandibular joint, but that is where your mandibular condyle is. And that is where the mandible, which is your jaw, articulates with and is able to rock back and forth so that we can open and close our mouths. Which then leads us to, and so again, this is the skull flipped over, and I have to do this, and you can see this on page 23 of your coloring book in order to show you the occipital bone. Now, if you take your hand and you put it on the back of your head, you're touching the occipital bone, but most of the occipital bone actually makes up the bottom of your skull. And with the occipital bone, you can see here in green, you have the parietal bones. You can see in the orangey color, you have your temporal bones. And so we have a suture right here and a suture right here that attaches the parietal bones and the temporal bones to the occipital bone. And that suture is called the lambdoid suture. L-A-M-B-D-O-I-D, the lambdoid suture. So the coronal suture is like your bang part. That's where it goes from ear to ear, where your frontal bone attaches to your parietal bones. Your sagittal suture runs right down the middle of your head, just like the part that goes right down the middle of your head. That attaches your two parietal bones together. If you were to take your fingers and tuck your hair behind your ears, you are following the pathway of the squamous suture, which attaches the parietal bone to the temporal bones. And in the back of your head, kind of where your hair ends, you can kind of imagine that that's where the lambdoid suture would be found. And so in this picture here, you can see again that we have flipped the skull over, and you can see the temporal bones. And right here, you can see that bridge that I was talking about. Okay, a lot of people call that their cheekbone, but in reality, that is the zygomatic process of the temporal bones. Okay. Right here, you can kind of see there's a vampire tooth sticking up. That is your styloid process. And right here, that's the bump behind your ear. That's your mastoid process. And in between the two, right there, you can see a small opening. That is your stylomastoid foramen, like I mentioned before on the other slide. That hole is there so that nerves and blood vessels can pass through that actually tell you to open and close your jaw. Now, looking at the occipital bone is everything that's in brown here. And you'll notice this huge hole right here in the middle. Okay? It's a hole, so it is a foramen, and it's a big hole. It's called the foramen magnum. This is where your spinal cord passes into your skull in order to attach to your brain. And you know that your skull sits on top of your vertebra. And we have a movable joint, and so we have these things called condyles. And again, in another video that I've done, I've talked about condyles. And condyles are smooth areas where two bones articulate with each other, and they're covered with cartilage. So you have these two occipital condyles, and they sit on top of your very first vertebra. And most of your vertebrae do not have names, but your very first vertebra is called your atlas, because if you know mythology, Atlas is the gentleman who held the world on his shoulders. And so Atlas is the very first vertebra we have because it is holding your skull on top of your vertebra, on top of your backbone. So with the occipital condyle, we have the foramen magnum, or excuse me, with the occipital bone, we have the foramen magnum, we have these two occipital condyles, and you can't really see it, but right here, we have a bump. And if you run your fingers kind of towards the lower part of the back of your head, kind of close to your neck, you will probably feel a bump back there. It's a bump. It's going to have a B in it. It's called your occipital protuberance. Okay? Occipital protuberance. Tuberance lets you know it's a bump. It's a tubercle, and it's where some of your neck muscles attach that help hold your brain in place. So here's just a picture, an actual picture of a skull, and you can see that there's different things labeled on here. Now, with this one here, letter G would be where the occipital protuberance is found. Letter L is your foramen magnum. Letter H on both sides is your occipital condyles. Letter D is actually pointing to the zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone. But this part right here is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Letter F is representing that bump behind your ear. That's what we call your mastoid process. Now, we also have internal cranial bones. So this is as if we've taken the top of your skull off, and the lines here kind of show you where the sutures are found. So you can see that all this back here is occipital bone. And then there's your foramen magnum right there. And then we have kind of this butterfly inside here. Oops, oh, my line got a little crazy there. Well, if you look inside of a skull, you'll kind of see what looks like a butterfly, or it has wings. Well, that's what we call the sphenoid bone. It's called the butterfly bone or the winged bone. And the sphenoid bone has some special features to it. Now, with this picture here, it's kind of hard to see because the word sphenoid is right in the middle. But right where the word sphenoid is, there's a groove, and you can actually stick your pinky or a pencil down inside of it. And that groove is what's called the sella turica, S-E-L-L-A, and then turica, or some people say turcicia, T-U-R-C-I-C-A. The sella turica, or turcicia, if you were to pick your brain up out of your skull, you would see what looks like two blueberries hanging from it. And that's your pituitary gland. And your pituitary gland is very important. That's why it's hidden inside of your skull. It makes a lot of hormones. Well, your pituitary gland sits down inside of this groove, and that groove is called the sella turica, so that your brain doesn't smash it. And this portion right here, again, it's kind of hard to see from the picture, but this portion up here actually sticks up. So if you were to make an L with your hands, the groove of the L would be the sella turica. And your fingers, your index finger and your pointer finger and your middle finger, that would be the portion that's sticking up. That's called the dorsa cellum. Dorsa, D-O-R-S-A, and then cellum, S-E-L-L-U-R, U-M. The dorsa cellum sticks up, so the brain sits on top of that, and it keeps us from smashing our pituitary gland. Now, if you were to look into the skull, and you can Google, I don't want to go backwards, because sometimes if I go backwards, it messes up the video. But if you were to look into the skull, and if you have the coloring book on page 22, if you were to look into a skull, there are two holes in the back of our eye sockets. There's one hole per eye socket. And if you had the skull here, if you were to stick a pencil in this hole right here, and you know it's a hole, so it's called a foramen. If you were to stick a pencil, it comes out inside of the eyes. That's what's called the optic foramen. The optic foramen is where the optic nerve passes through the bone in order to attach your brain to your eye. So the optic foramen is actually part of your occipital bone. Excuse me, it's actually part of your sphenoid bone. Now, when we talk about blood vessels, You guys know you have arteries and you know you have veins. Well, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So most of your arteries in your body are carrying nutrients to the organs, and veins bring blood back to the heart. So most of the veins in your body are bringing waste products back to the heart. And your body considers arteries to be more important than veins because arteries are carrying nutrients. Well, in your sphenoid bone, you have two other small openings. They're also foramens. They're holes, so nutrients, blood vessels, and nerves can pass through. But right here, you have these two small openings. Now, one opening is a little bit larger than the other. This opening right here, the bigger one, is called the carotid fossa. It's not a socket, so it's not really a fossa. It's a foramen, it's a hole. But this is where your carotid artery passes. And your carotid artery takes blood, nutrient-rich blood, straight up to your brain. The smaller hole is called the jugular fossa. It's not a fossa, it's a foramen. It is a hole, and that's where your jugular vein passes through. And your jugular vein is what takes blood from the brain. So these are buried deep so that we can protect those arteries and those veins, but those openings are part of your sphenoid bone. Now, up here, inside of your skull, you also have what's called the ethmoid bone, and that's everything that's on this screen in yellow. It's basically what you would think of as, if you think of your sinuses, this is the roof of your sinuses. It articulates with your frontal bone, and the ethmoid bone is actually wavy. It's what's called the cribriform plate. So if you have your coloring book on page 23, you can see they've taken the top portion of the skull off, and letter C there represents your ethmoid bone, and it is wavy. It's what's called your cribriform plate. If you could punch a hole through your nose, like if you could go inside of your nostril and poke a hole upward to go into your sinuses, you're underneath the ethmoid bone. And the cribriform plate is wavy in order to increase surface area. Now you also have this kind of weird oval triangle area right in the middle, and that is what's called your crista galli. Crista, C-R-I-S-T-A-E, galli, G-A-L-L-I. The crista galli is what's commonly called the hitching post. And for those of you who have horses or know anything about horses, you would tie them to a hitching post. Well, your brain is an organ, so it has a membrane that goes around it, and that membrane is called your meninges. Well, your meninges attach to the crista galli in the ethmoid bone, which is part of the cribriform plate. Now, so again, when we talk about the bones, we've just looked at your cranial bones. And the cranial bones are the ones that make up what's called your brain cavity. It's your one frontal bone, your two parietal bones, your two temporal bones, your one occipital bone, your one sphenoid bone, and your one ethmoid bone. And this is just another little picture of, you can see the supraorbital foramens, the glabella, just different features of the skull. And so the next video I'm going to do is going to talk about the bones of the face. Thanks for spending some time with me. Oh, before I forget, let's just go ahead and do this one. We have what's called the hyoid bone. Now, your hyoid bone is not part of your skull, but since it's on this slide or in this video, I'll just go ahead and talk about it. Your hyoid bone is pretty cool because it's the only bone in your body that does not articulate with another bone, which means it doesn't form a joint. Well, remember, skeletal muscles get their name because these muscles attach to your skeleton. Well, your tongue is skeletal muscle. And if you look at a picture of a skull that's put together, or if you have, a plaster cast skull, there's no place for your tongue to attach. So we have this thing called the hyoid bone, and this is the bone that our tongue attaches to. And again, it's the only bone in your body that does not form a joint with your other bones.